When Platinum Dunes announced in 2008 that they would reboot Wes Craven's 1984 classic A Nightmare on Elm Street, horror fans braced for something interesting. While some welcomed the move, the others expected the worst. And yet, I must agree that the setup sounded promising. Michael Bay's producing team had just bankrolled successful remakes of Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2003, the Amityville Horror in 2005, and Friday the 13th in 2009. Initially, Platinum Dunes planned to follow the same formula as the Friday the 13th reboot, which was set to basically take the best elements from each of the films in the original series and create a single storyline with them. Producer Brad Fuller insisted Freddy Krueger would stop cracking wise and start scaring people again. With this, it's more about terrifying and unsettling, making people have horrible nightmares, he said in an interview. In other words, Platinum Dunes wanted to strip away Freddy's campy one-liners and return him to pure nightmare fuel. By the time cameras rolled, they ditched the best-of patchwork approach and decided to stick closely to Craven's original 1984 story, only darker. Freddy's goofball quips were gone, and he was explicitly recast as a child molester monster, just as Craven originally envisioned in 1984 before real-life scandals prompted a change. All this on a relatively modest horror budget of around $35 million. But then something happened to the movie, and it basically ended up becoming the most controversial project of the franchise. But what the hell really happened? Let's find out. Oh, and if you still haven't subscribed and liked yet, hit those buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. And now, let's get back to the subject at hand. The director's chair for this one went to Samuel Bayer, a music video legend who had never made a feature before. Bay insisted on him, but initially the deal fell flat. Bayer, who had been the director of Nirvana's Smell Like Teen Spirit and many iconic music videos, had politely declined Platinum Dunes twice. Only when Michael Bay personally emailed Bayer about this business opportunity did he relent. He said in an interview, "When you get an email from the highest paid individual in Hollywood, you need to listen." In Bayer's words, jumping into a big feature from music videos, and that too in his late 40s, felt like a virgin talking about sex in his 40s. But Bay's pitch, in addition to the promise of reimagining one of horror's all-time villains, eventually got Bayer on board. Casting Freddy Krueger meant replacing Robert Englund, the man who was Freddy for 8 films. New Line originally wanted an unknown actor. Then casting director Toby Emmerich saw Jackie Earle Haley in Little Children from 2006 and flipped out. He told colleagues that Haley embodied Freddy's blend of malevolence and anger and a hint of vulnerability, and this is what the man had to say about Jackie. He just seemed completely right for the part. Bayer and producers even watched Haley's breakout Rorschach audition from Watchmen, and it blew Bayer's mind. In fact, fans of the character had already started mentioning Haley's name in message boards before the studio even called him. Haley admits he was briefly spooked by the chance to play such a twisted killer, but seeing Freddy as a sort of mythical boogeyman made it fun. In fact, original Freddy actor Robert Englund was also on board. He praised Haley's lean, wiry build and said it was like a little rabid dog nipping at your ankles. Englund even signed off on the casting. Wes Craven was another story. He was not consulted and later said it hurt that he wasn't involved. Once underway, the new film wasted no time in going darker than any Elm Street before. One of the biggest switches was confirming Freddy as a genuine child molester. Craven had originally written him that way in 1984, but changed it to a child murderer on advice of the studio and amid a real daycare abuse scandal at the time. Here, Freddy was the creepy preschool groundskeeper who lured kids into a cave, Nancy among them, to torture and photograph them. The movie even has Nancy's mom flatly say he molested the children, including Nancy. He was his favorite. There is a brief tease that maybe Freddy was framed by the parents, but the film ultimately affirms he was really guilty. This was Freddy returned to his most vile incarnation, far from the wisecracking clown of later sequels, and it shocked even some horror fans. The physical look of Freddy was also reimagined, unfortunately. Makeup veteran Bart J. Mixon crafted elaborate burn prosthetics for Jackie Earle Haley that looked disturbingly real in person, but the studio overrode him with tons of CGI. Mixon later told iHorror that while the makeup looks pretty good when Jackie left our trailer, the digital effects team went out of control. In post-production, multiple CGI houses were pretty much out of control once the producer's oversight was gone, and they added senseless holes all over Freddy's face. The end result was that the viewers thought that the new Freddy looked like a turtle or even a burnt chicken nugget. Critics slammed the success CGI as offensive to burn victims and less scary than the original practical makeup. In short, instead of a scarred ghost, we got a creepy tortoise monster that no one wanted to see. One of the few original ideas in the remake was the micronaps plot device. Writer Eric Heiswerer concocted a scenario where after about 70 hours without sleep, the human brain forces tiny seconds-long naps to recharge. In the film, these moments mean a character is actually dreaming while their body is technically awake, letting Freddy sneak in. This enabled scenes like Chris's psychotic pharmacy trip, set to the Everly Brothers' All I Have to Do Is Dream, where she's hallucinating but thinks she's awake. It's a neat concept on paper, but microsleeps are a very real thing. Yeah, so they are basically brief involuntary dozing episodes that can hit extremely sleep-deprived people. But Elm Street plays it up unrealistically and gets some science wrong. Insomniacs do experience momentary lapses in awareness, but the movie turns it into a constant dream state. In the end, it's a small change that adds tension in places, but it's largely one of the few new tricks this remake had. Moving on. Playing Nancy Holbrook, renamed from Thompson, was Rooney Mara, who was then an unknown. Nancy is portrayed as painfully shy and awkward. Bayer called her the loneliest girl in the world, and Mara herself said that her Nancy really doesn't know how to connect with people. Ironically, this would be Mara's toughest acting gig. She has since said making Elm Street was not a great experience and it nearly made her quit acting altogether. She even confessed that during auditioning, she sort of tried to fail on purpose to avoid getting the role. By the time Elm Street wrapped in mid-2009, Mara was ready to walk away from Hollywood, and it was only when she later auditioned for The Social Network and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo that her career was saved. For Mara today, the remake is probably little more than a footnote because her breakout roles pretty much came immediately afterward in those award-winning dramas. Wes Craven himself could only watch from afar. He openly expressed heartbreak that he wasn't involved. Craven told IGN he literally gave up all rights in the 1980s just to get the original made, and now he did not even know who's doing it. And in the same interview, he said that it hurts because Nightmare was the film he probably loved the most. He admitted he never even watched the 2010 movie. He contrasted it with his experience on The Last House on the Left remake, where, as a consulting producer, he was much happier, he could shepherd it, and chose a director he liked. In short, Craven felt this reboot was a slap in the face to the original vision, and he openly disowned it. The film itself was shot mostly in Illinois from May to July 2009. Why Illinois, you ask? Well, Platinum Dunes liked Illinois and the tax breaks there. The production used local high schools like Elk Grove High and John Hersey High in Arlington Heights to double for Springwood High and shot scenes in Chicago suburbs, for instance, those showing Nancy and Chris's childhood homes on Barrington's Linden Road. Even Springwood's graveyard was a real cemetery in Elgin. The one big exception was the diner where Dean first dies. This was shot in Sherman Oaks, California. By July, the camera work was done, and only the Nightmare scenes with Haley's Freddy needed some green screen or post effects. When Nightmare 2010 finally hit theaters on April 30th, 2010, it was a box office juggernaut, at least initially. It opened at $32.9 million in its first week, breaking the record for midnight showings of an R-rated horror film at $1.6 million. It ended up grossing about $63 million domestically and roughly $117.7 million worldwide. That made it by far the highest grossing entry in the Nightmare franchise. In fact, it was the second biggest slasher remake of that era, just behind the Friday the 13th reboot. On paper, that's success. On screen and in critics' minds, however, it was a disaster. Reviewers gave it roughly 15% on Rotten Tomatoes and a Metacritic score around 35. After its huge opening, it collapsed like a deck of cards in a cyclone. You see, the second week box office plunged about 72% to $9.1 million. Audiences were confused and let down. Critics and fans alike declared Nightmare 2010 one of the worst horror remakes ever made, citing its dreary tone and lifeless cast. By the 6th or 7th repeat of the Freddy theme, the novelty wears off, despite dagger-like orchestrations, which was a slap at the film's uninspired score as much as its slavish nostalgia. In short, it became a punchline of the horror community. Given that box office haul, you'd think sequels were guaranteed. Platinum Dunes even hinted at a 3D follow-up right after opening weekend. In fact, Cast contracts were written for 2 sequels, everyone from Haley to Mara to the new teenagers were signed up for more films, but nothing happened. A new reboot was announced in 2015 with Conjuring 2 scribe David Leslie Johnson, but by 2016, Nightmare had once again fallen through the cracks. In 2019, Wes Craven's estate quietly regained the US rights. Craven had died in 2015, while New Line kept only 4 in distribution. This split ownership turned Freddy into a legal hot potato. In 2025, New Line's president Richard Brenner admitted that any Elm Street revival is complicated because of the rights, but simply, the messy contract and the toxic reputation of the 2010 movie have kept Freddy Krueger off the screens ever since. As for the rest of the cast, most of them quietly moved on. Kyle Gallner and Katie Cassidy were decent young actors, and Gallner has had a steady career in film and TV since, but Nightmare is not something either of them would be too proud of. Thomas Dekker, who plays Jesse, Kellen Lutz, who plays Dean, and character actors Clancy Brown and Connie Britton simply survive on their resumes. Rooney Mara and Gallner arguably got the best future credits. Mara went on to Oscar-nominated and blockbuster roles, but you have to dig her filmography to find Elm Street. Most of the supporting teens are just a memory. The musical score by Transformers composer Steve Jablonsky tried to bring back the original's vibe. Jablonsky said that he integrated elements of Charles Bernstein's 1984 themes, and Fuller noted it would feel reminiscent of the 1980s with its heavy use of synthesizers. He recorded it with a 60-piece orchestra and even a 15-person children's choir singing a creepy motif. The idea was to echo that moody synth and string sound of 80s horror. In reality, most listeners found Jablonsky's score perfectly competent but unremarkable. There are a few cool moments, a subtle string version of the Freddy theme here, an eerie lullaby there, but critics said much of it was generic ominous noise. Wired's reviewer quipped that after half a dozen repeats of the It's Freddy string theme, the novelty wears off. In short, the music didn't become an instant classic like Charles Bernstein's original Industrial Pulse. It was just part of the wallpaper. Orchestral, synth-heavy, but ultimately forgettable. In the end, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 went down as a case study of what not to do. The movie made plenty of money, but it killed its franchise. Unlike Halloween and Friday the 13th, which both returned to new sequels and reboots in the 2010s, Freddy has been oddly absent for a decade and a half. The remake's heavy CGI over practical effects, its pointless emphasis on Freddy as pedophile, which most fans felt added nothing, and its slavishly shot-for-shot recreations of iconic scenes all drew ire. The overall mood was joyless. I often feel sad that where the original Elm Street had originality and dark wit, the remake felt like a lecture on how to make bad horror. Even 15 years later, Nightmare 2010 is cited among the worst horror remakes ever. It's become a bitter punchline for fans who wonder seriously, what the F happened?